Star Trek, Mission to Horatius, Chapter 9, Mickey Again. Captain James Kirk was sprawled in his command chair, staring unseeingly at the bridge viewing screen when Dr. McCoy approached from the elevator. Kirk looked up and smiled. "Well, Bones, you should be happy. At long last you have your wish. We're on course to the nearest star base. Mission accomplished, as always when the Enterprise is involved." McCoy said grumpily, "I suggest you have Commander Spock reset your watches, Jim." Kirk frowned. "How do you mean?" "I mean that Nurse Christine Chapel and I have 40 men and women in stasis, and the number is increasing steadily." 40? In deep sleep? Have you gone completely around the corner, Bones? We won't be able to work the ship." McCoy said grimly, "Jim, it's the only thing we've been able to hit upon, and we're going to that extreme only with the more severe cases. Half the ship's complement is showing the preliminary symptoms of space cafford. How long it will be before Nurse Chapel or I makes a mistake and underdiagnoses a serious case in the laps of the gods. One cafford-crazed crewman running berserk through the ship, and the mental contagion will spread like a forest fire, Jim. The whole ship could fall apart within the hour." Kirk, as well as every other person on the bridge, was staring in dismay at the ship's doctor. Kirk said, "What are the symptoms? How can you tell if a man's about to go over the edge, Bones?" McCoy looked him straight in the face. He said very slowly, "That tick in your left eye, Jim. You've been under too much strain for too long. I suggest you come to the sick bay for a checkup after your watch is over. Rank has no privileges so far as cafford is concerned." James Kirk slumped slightly in his command chair as though very tired. He shook his head wearily, as if attempting to reject what the other had just said. A messman from the steward department came around with coffee. Kirk wanted none, but McCoy took a cup and sipped at it. He said, "How did the landing of young Grang come off?" Captain Kirk stirred and said, "Fine. We launched one of the shuttlecraft and hovered above the entrance of the Wolf Clan cave. Then, using the loudspeaker, we gave them the full story, puffing up Grang to the skies and letting it be known that through his efforts the raiders will never again be seen. They welcomed him as though he were a Greek hero straight out of Homer." Ensign Chekhov entered from the elevator and was unable to repress his chuckling. Kirk looked over at him. "Someone has managed to find something humorous on the Enterprise these days, Mr. Chekhov?" There was a seldom-heard tone of irritation in the voice of Captain James Kirk. The younger officer wasn't put off, however. He said, "Yes, sir. It was Mickey, sir." "Mickey?" Sulu blurted out from his helmsman chair nearby. Lieutenant Uhura said, "The rat? See, Sulu, I told you he'd turn up again." Ensign Chekhov was explaining to the captain. "Taylor and I saw him running down a corridor, sir. It was very funny. He wasn't exactly running. He was kind of dancing along. We almost caught him for Sulu, but he got away." Dr. McCoy's cup clattered and his coffee spilled over unnoticed. "Dancing?" he snapped. Chekhov looked at him in surprise. "Sure, Doc. He danced along. Sometimes he even kind of got up on his hind legs." Dr. McCoy darted for the elevator. Kirk, astonished, called, "Where are you off to, Bones?" "The sick bay," the other called over his shoulder and was gone. Kirk grunted. "All this obsession with space cafford. I'm beginning to suspect Bones has a case of it himself." Sulu's face was white. Kirk noticed a stricken expression. "What's the matter with you, Mr. Sulu? Has everybody on this bridge suddenly gone around the bend?" Sulu blurted, "Plague." "What are you talking about?" Kirk demanded. "Sir, back when Mr. Spock first told me that Mickey wasn't an exotic alien life form, but merely a rat originally from Earth, I looked the subject up in the library. I read all about rats, sir. Back in the old days on Earth, rats carried bubonic plague. When they have it themselves, they act queer. Oh my. Sometimes they seem to dance." Kirk snapped, "Lieutenant, give me the sickbay on the intercom at once." "Aye, sir." The sickbay faded in. Dr. McCoy's bent over a computer hood. Nurse Christine Chapel immediately behind him. There was a feeling of tension in the air. Kirk barked, "Well?" McCoy looked up into the screen and ran his tongue over his underlip. "Bubonic plague," he said. also known as Black Death from the dark-colored spots of blood under the skin which accompany it. In the past, the disease caused the deaths of millions, particularly during the Middle Ages, when it's estimated that 3/4 of the population of Europe was wiped out in one epidemic. It was caused by the Bacillus pestis, which was transmitted by the rat flea. Its symptoms include vomiting, diarrhea, hemorrhaging, swelling of the joints, and discoloration of the skin. The disease lasts from 1 to 30 days and is usually fatal. It has been completely unknown in the Federation planets, having disappeared from Earth in the late 20th century. The vaccine was always effective, according to my records here. Kirk said, "What does it all boil down to, so far as the Enterprise is concerned, Bones?" McCoy's face was wan. "If that elusive rat is carrying bubonic plague, Captain, What if he is? We'll just have to give the whole crew shots for..." But McCoy is shaking his head. "Captain, there hasn't been a case of plague on Earth or any of the Federation planets for centuries. I haven't any vaccine." There was a long, pregnant silence. Not an officer or crewman on the ship's bridge made a sound. Finally, Kirk said softly, "What will we have to do, Dr. McCoy?" "We've got to destroy that animal. How much longer is the cruise to last, Captain?" "Possibly 3 months, now that we're finally on our way back." Dr. McCoy took a deep breath and said, "If any of us ever expect to see our homes again, we must find Mickey. We may all be dead before the Enterprise ever gets back to the Federation, but even if we aren't, we'll never see our homes again until that rat is eliminated." Kirk scowled. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean there hasn't been any bubonic plague on any Federation planet for centuries, and most certainly nobody from the Enterprise would be allowed to land until the ship was pronounced free of danger from it. We'd be quarantined, Captain." "Holy smokes," Chekhov blurted. "This gets serious." Captain Kirk's eyes went to Sulu. "Mr. Sulu, undoubtedly you know more about this Mickey, as you named him, than anyone else. The responsibility is yours. Requisition any men or equipment you need. Your orders are to get that rat." Sulu came to his feet. "Aye, aye, sir." Spock said, "Just a minute, Captain." "Well, Mr. Spock, comments?" "Captain, a short time ago, Dr. McCoy announced that he now had 40 of the ship's personnel in stasis as a precaution against Cafford. The Enterprise is understaffed, particularly in Mr. Scott's engine section, where they're working on a round-the-clock basis trying to keep the ship's engines in shape to provide us with as high a warp factor as possible." "Your point, Mr. Spock?" "I don't see where Mr. Sulu is going to find the manpower for his search." McCoy spoke up in the intercom screen. "Cafford is based on monotony and boredom carried to the ultimate extreme. I don't think men searching the ship with their lives at stake would be subject to boredom. I'll release my patients from stasis." Kirk said, "Very good, Doctor. But just one other thing. Can't you devise a new vaccine or whatever in the sickbay laboratory to handle this potential plague epidemic?" McCoy looked at him testily. "I can try, Jim. However, I might point out that I've been warning you for many months that the supplies of the Enterprise are depleted far beyond the point that makes sense. Not just engine room supplies and steward department supplies, but medical supplies as well. But there's another problem." "Yes?" "Jim, in the ship's library computer banks, would you expect to find under the heading of engineering or whatever a description of a wheel and how to build it?" Kirk didn't follow him. "A wheel?" "Yes, a common wheel. Man has been making wheels since shortly after he emerged from the caves. It's been a problem we solved thousands of years ago." "I don't get the connection, Bones." McCoy said impatiently, "Captain, the problem of bubonic plague was solved centuries ago. Nobody's interested in it anymore, except historians, perhaps. To make it short, Jim, there's no information in my medical computer banks dealing with bubonic plague." His face faded from the screen. Kirk turned worriedly to his first officer. "Mr. Spock, if you please, check the ship's central library computer banks for any and all information on the Middle Ages disease of bubonic plague. You might also cross-check under the Black Death." "Yes, Captain." Spock bent over his hooded screen. Kirk touched a button on his command chair. "All hands, this is the captain. Now hear this. The ship is in a condition of emergency alert. A small animal brought aboard as a pet has been lost somewhere on the ship. It is now reported that it is most likely carrying a virulent disease, once known as plague. Dr. McCoy has revealed that even if we can avoid an epidemic which would decimate the ship's complement, we will be placed in quarantine upon arrival at the nearest star base. If the Enterprise is successfully to complete this mission, the rat Mickey must be found and destroyed. With the assistance of all hands, Sulu went about Operation Mickey with an efficient thoroughness. The briefing room was set up as command headquarters of the search. To the extent possible, the search teams were assigned to the areas of the ship they knew best. Engine men combed the engineering section. Deck men searched the main saucer section of the vessel. The storage compartments, galleys, and mess halls were given a thorough going over by members of the steward department. All crew members were issued clothing which could be tied tightly about the cuffs and even at the collar, protection, it was hoped, against the rat flea and its deadly bacillus. Every square inch was explored. Sulu's men progressed from one compartment to the next, searching each room with a care that would have made impossible the hiding of a cockroach. After each compartment was searched, its space-tight doors were locked, nor were they allowed open again until there were several other safe compartments between it and the balance of the unsearched ship. Operation Mickey went on ruthlessly, carefully. It began in the nose of the ship, covered the bridge, and combed back toward the stern, and then down into the engineering section. The work had the full cooperation and sympathy of the entire ship's company. Gambling was taboo in space, but it was known there was a pool among the crew on just when Mickey would bite the dust. One of the ship's clerks even instituted a bulletin, which was broadcast over the intercom every half hour on the progress of the search. Interest piqued. In the wardroom, Lieutenant Uhura, down now to 2 strings on her guitar, began the composition of The Saga of Mickey the Space Rat. She left the last stanza incomplete, explaining that it was reserved for the final fate of Mickey. Finally, Sulu emerged onto the bridge, attired in the uniform of the search, cuffs tied tight, phaser pistol at his belt. He approached the captain's command chair and came to attention. "Eh?" Kirk said. "Got him at last, huh? Where was he, Mr. Sulu? I imagine down in one of the food storage holds." Sulu moistened his lips. "Sir, we searched every compartment in the ship." "I know you did, Mr. Sulu. It was a fantastic job in its thoroughness. It's unnecessary to go into details. Where was the little beast?" "We didn't find him, sir." Captain James Kirk shot to his feet. "What?" Sulu said desperately. "Captain, I have one last plan that simply can't fail." Kirk stared at him. "What do you mean?" "Well, sir, it might seem a little unorthodox, but Mickey couldn't possibly escape." "Very well, Mr. Sulu, but this seems to be taking a ridiculously long time. Get on with it." Sulu hesitated. Then, taking a deep breath, he said, "Sir, my plan is to saturate the ship with chlorine gas." "Chlorine gas?" "Yes, sir," Sulu said. "The whole ship, every compartment, every room, every nook and corner, every cranny, with chlorine gas." Spock said, "Most interesting. Why chlorine, Mr. Sulu?" Sulu looked at him. "I checked with the chief engineer. He has the materials to manufacture a sufficient quantity of chlorine. Also, it's heavier than air. It will sink into every crevice on board." Ensign Chekhov snorted. "'Tisn't bad enough that we're threatened first for space comfort and then the bubonic plague. Now Sulu wants to gas us." "That will be all, Mr. Chekhov," Captain said curtly, and then to Sulu, "Let's have the rest of it." "Sir," Sulu said doggedly, "the whole crew can be put in spacesuits and remain in them for 3 hours. In that time, we can fill the ship with gas. Nobody knows where Mickey's managed to hide himself, but wherever it is, the gas will get him. After 3 hours, we can blow the ship clean with the ventilation system, and it will be safe to discard the spacesuits." Kirk looked at Spock. "Comments, Mr. Spock?" Spock's face was thoughtful. "Captain, it seems fairly reasonable to me. Not only Mickey, but any rat fleas he carries would be susceptible to chlorine, a most deadly gas of the halogen family, once used in warfare. And, as you know, our other alternatives are rapidly disappearing. Neither Dr. McCoy nor I has been able to locate anything in our library banks that would help us fight the disease, which amazes me." Kirk muttered and sneezed. Not at all, Captain. We can find historical references to bubonic plague, but as the doctor has pointed out, there is no call for a description of the Black Death and its cure to be on file. It has long since been conquered and is now medically unknown." Kirk turned again to Sulu. Very well, Mr. Sulu, make the necessary arrangements. You have my go-ahead. And my sniffles. So they donned their spacesuits, the intrepid personnel of the pride of the Starfleet, the USS Enterprise, and they deluged their ship with the deadly green gas. They saturated it. They let the gas soak into every corner and crevice for 3 full hours. Then they blew the ship clear. When officers and crew climbed from their suits all over the vessel, they looked sheepishly at each other. It had been a long fight, and they had won, but somehow they weren't proud of the victory. They knew that somewhere in his remote hiding place, Mickey was dead, but they found little satisfaction in the fact. It was as though a respected adversary had been conquered, and conquered by superior weight of numbers, by trickery, by double-dealing, not by honest warfare. A toast was drunk to Mickey's passing in the captain's quarters, and similar ones for the juniors officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted men's messes. All listened respectfully when Lieutenant Uhura sang over the intercom the last stanza of the saga of Mickey the Space Rat, which should be the end of the story of Mickey, but isn't. With the passing of Operation Mickey, the ship drifted back into its routine, and in a week's time, except for the occasional nostalgic conversations about Mickey, the little rodent was forgotten. Lethargy was again the word, and the monotony of space travel once again flung its drab coat over the Enterprise. Between watches, Captain James Kirk drifted one day into the sickbay. His eyes went about the three-room complex, noting unhappily that all the beds in the sickbay proper were occupied. Dr. McCoy straightened up from the electronic microscope over which he had been bent. Kirk motioned with his head at the men in the beds. "Stasis again?" The doctor nodded wordlessly. "As many as before?" "There soon will be," Kirk said. "We're only a month out. You'd think that the prospect of the mission finally being over would hold them." "It's been too long, Jim. Much too long." "You think we'll make it?" "I don't know. One bad case to start it rolling, and we'll have had it, Jim." There was a roar from the corridor beyond. Both Kirk and the doctor spun, eyes wide in dismay. Was this the all-out case of Cafford they'd been dreading? "What's that?" the captain rasped, heading for the door. The shouting continued, and now they could begin to make out the words. "Mickey! Mickey!" At the door, Kirk exclaimed. "They've gone off the rockers!" The doctor was immediately behind him. Yeoman Janice Rand came hurrying up, her face flushed with excitement. "Captain, it's Mickey! They saw Mickey again, down in the ship's chapel. He's alive! Mickey's still alive! Don't be ridiculous!" But she was gone, darting down the corridor with the sounds of excitement. The captain looked at Dr. McCoy, his mouth slightly open. "But he couldn't be alive." It was all-out warfare now. Before the campaign against Mickey had been pursued coldly, carefully, and without passion. The rat had been a potential danger, a threat to the whole ship, and was to be destroyed ruthlessly. Even so, there had been considerable sympathy for the little rodent. Now it was different. An emotional crisis seemed to seize upon every man and woman aboard. The time and interest of everyone, from ship's officers to messmen, were devoted to the finding and destruction of Mickey. Groups, pairs, and solitary hunters roamed the ship at all hours, haggard and red-eyed, but armed to the teeth and seeking the elusive diseased rat. The situation was a deadly serious one now. They were nearing their destination, and they needed desperately to land to escape the confinement of the starship. They needed to see their families, their wives, their sweethearts. They longed to see blue sky above them, to sprawl on beaches, swim in the sea, hike the countryside, ride, climb, run free of all limitations on space. The very thought of being confined indefinitely under quarantine against bubonic plague drove them to frenzy. Mickey was flushed thrice in the first week. He escaped desperately each time, the roars of the hunters behind him. In the second week of the wild hunt for him, he was knocked down by half a dozen phasers on stun effect when he ventured into an ambush in storage compartment 8. He was quickly rushed to the ship's waste matter converter. The men who had approached and handled him were rushed to sickbay for immediate decontamination. Somehow it didn't seem real. It didn't seem possible that Mickey could be dead. Like the lives of his legendary foe, the cat, Mickey the rat's lives had seemed all but endless. That night, Lieutenant Uhura was compelled by celebrating shipmates to write a final stanza to her saga, but when she took up her guitar to sing it, one of the 2 strings remaining went bing. She made a woeful face in disgust. 1 string left, she said. Well, she stood up, folded her arms, and began doing a takeoff on the shuffling walk of a Chinese woman playing a single-stringed instrument. Lieutenant Chang, laughing, said, "This is too much. We've got to get back now, if only to buy new strings for Uhura's guitar." Aftermath. They were within hours of Starbase touchdown. Captain James Kirk sauntered along the ship's corridors, his face thoughtful. He reached the quarters of his first officer and knocked. When Spock's voice answered, he pushed his way in, still meditative. Dr. McCoy was seated there. Obviously, he and Spock had been in deep conversation. The Vulcan came to his feet. "Ah, Captain, are we soon to go into orbit?" "A couple of hours or so, Mr. Spock." The captain looked at Dr. McCoy. "I figured out where Mickey was hiding," he said. Mr. Spock's eyebrows went up, but Dr. McCoy said, "Oh, I thought you might. How?" "Several little items that didn't quite jibe. For instance, supposedly plague has been unknown on Federation worlds for centuries, but it was on a Federation planet that Sulu acquired Mickey. Then, too, if the animal had the disease, how did he live aboard for so many months? Why didn't he die of it? And the way Mickey kept turning up just at the crucial time, when you needed something to get the crew's minds off their frustrations." Kirk turned his eyes to Spock. "It never occurred to me to doubt your word when you said there was nothing in the ship's library computer banks on the cure for bubonic plague. Of course there was. Those banks contain all the information compiled by man down through the ages, including how to cure diseases now forgotten. But, of course, if Bones was to pull off his scheme and keep the crew's mind off Cafford, he had to have your cooperation." Spock said mildly, "A very interesting predicament, this danger of space, Cafford. I was happy to work with the doctor." Kirk looked back at Dr. McCoy. "Where did you have him hidden? In the sick bay?" "Most of the time," the doctor nodded. "When the ship was being gassed, I had him in an oxygen tent. While Sulu was searching the sickbay compartments, I had him tucked inside my tunic." "You must have had a bit of trouble teaching him how to dance." "A bit. Something to occupy my off hours." McCoy twisted his face wryly. "Even a doctor is subject to Cafford if he gets bored enough." Captain James Kirk looked at the two of them wryly. "I suppose I should have something to say about discipline and about a starship captain being hoodwinked by his first officer and ship surgeon. However, I can't think of anything." He turned to go. Dr. McCoy said, "One thing, Captain." Kirk half turned. "Yes?" "Jim, please don't allow us to get into this spot again. I don't know how I'd ever keep Cafford from hitting the ship next time."